Hi, my name is John Harvey, and I'm a professor of economics at Texas Christian University. And this video is part of the Up to Us TCU campaign designed to educate the student body about how the national debt actually works and how it affects them directly. This is the second in the series, so what I'm going to talk about is to whom the debt's actually owed and how they ended up owning that part of the U.S. government debt. Well, most people, of course, think that most U.S. government debt is actually owned by China, but that's absolutely false. By far, the single biggest holder of U.S. government debt is the U.S. government. As of September 2014, the U.S. government owned 42% of its own debt. A big chunk of that was owned by our own central bank, the Federal Reserve, which had 15%. And the reason they have any government debt whatsoever is because they use that to carry out monetary policy. When the Federal Reserve has money that they want to introduce into the macroeconomy, they can't just drop it out of a helicopter or something. What they do is they end up buying something from the public. And rather than buying, your old backpack or something like that, what the Fed does is they buy government treasury bills. So in other words, once the treasury bills are in the public and then the Federal Reserve wants to increase the money supply by, let's say, $10, what they'll do is they'll pay $10 for $10 worth of U.S. government treasury bills. So they trade places. The Fed gives you the $10 and you give them the treasury bills. So that's why they own 15% just by themselves. The rest of that 42% is owned by particular government agencies because there's lots of times when they have cash sitting around. If they've just collected taxes, for example, and they haven't spent the money yet, well, then you have to do something with that cash in between. And the safest investment on the planet remains U.S. government debt. Now, there is debt owed to foreigners, and that's 34%, and that's a much larger chunk than it used to be back, back in the when I first started teaching in 1987, certainly, and probably up through 1998, 2000 or so. It probably ranged around 15, 17%, but it's 34% now. Now that's total foreigners holding debt. Actually, only 7% is owned by China. Remember, I said the U.S. government owns 42% of its own debt. China only 7% of U.S. government debt. But the really important thing about how much debt China owns is not how much they have, but why they have it. It has nothing to do with the fact that the U.S. government was running deficits. It had to do with the fact that we were running trade deficits. Now, to differentiate there, the Chinese don't own American government debt because the U.S. government spent more than it earned. They own government debt because they exported more than they imported. Every year, for years now, we have purchased more goods and services from China than we have sold to them. So that means that at the end of every year, the Chinese have leftover dollars. And so they're trying to figure out, well, what are we going to do with these dollars? We don't want American goods and services. We've bought as many as we want. And the dollar by itself doesn't earn any return. So again, the safest investment on the planet is the U.S. Government debt, U.S. Treasury bills. So China has bought lots and lots of U.S. government Treasury bills, not because they're trying to loan money to the government to let the government continue to run, but because they had so much money left over after they had the trade surplus. If China had a trade deficit, they wouldn't own that debt. We would own their debt. And if the U.S. government had been running budget surpluses, and yet we still had those trade deficits to China, we would still owe money to China. It just might not be in government debt. Maybe at the end of the year when the Chinese found themselves with extra dollars, they would have bought up shares of Walmart or shares of Exxon. But instead, they bought a much safer investment, although it has a lower rate of return, and that is U.S. government debt. So, once again, these horror stories about China owning all this debt and what are we going to do, and they're loaning money to our government to run, has no basis in economics. The reason the Chinese own government debt is because they have trade surpluses. If you want to get rid of, if for some reason you were worried that the Chinese had this U.S. government debt, which you should not be, but if you were, then you say, well, then here's the solution, not for the government to run a balanced budget, but for the U.S. to have a trade surplus. And then to follow up on that, you think, well, then if it's because of trade surpluses, then surely other countries that have trade surpluses to the United States also own a lot of government debt, and that is exactly right. Number 2 on the list is Japan, and they're very close. They're also, if you round it off, they're also at 7%. But why? Because we've had trade deficits with Japan for years and years and years. And then who's number 3? Belgium. Belgium with 2% of all U.S. government debt. And why? Because we run trade deficits to them. Thank you.